All right, let's continue our team coverage on the subject right now with 11 Alive's Grace King joining us in studio. She has been in the courtroom through all this. Colt Gray's trial months ago, sat through the sentencings this week, and kudos to you and your journalism through all of this. It's just been spectacular. So thank you for taking the time to talk through it with us today. I think you have some new reporting for us, specifically when it comes to the father's sentence. Judge gave him 15 years. A lot of folks wondering, is he actually going to serve all 15?
Well, a lot of the families were disappointed because, again, the state was asking for 80 years, which effectively, Colin's 55 years old. They kind of thought that would be the rest of his life. They never wanted him to spend a day outside prison because they said they got a life sentence. And a lot of them were looking at the Georgia parole statutes, which says after a third of your sentence, there is that opportunity for parole. But I went ahead and contacted a parole expert this morning, Abby Taylor, that's her specialty. And she says there's a lot more factors that actually go into that one-third number. One thing they're going to look at is the level of severity for Colin's crimes. He's charged with second-degree murder. And although it's a crime of criminal negligence, that is a very serious crime. At that rate, she says you have to serve 65 to 90% of your sentence if they allow for parole. Again, complete discretion up to that parole board. But the minimum he would have to serve of that 15 years is about 65%, which is, 9, 10 years. He's also going to get credit for the 2 years he's already done in the Barrow County Jail. He's been in custody basically since the Apalachee High School shooting and when police began to realize that he might have some culpability here too. So we're looking at probably 7 years of that 15 when you hear that, or 9 years, but 7 more years, which would bring him to about 62. So we could possibly see him out in 7-8 years.
Was it expected when his own team got up there and said, we recommend Judge 10 years for our client? Or was that a surprise to folks in the courtroom?
Well, the minimum is time served for these crimes. None of the things Colin was charged with had any mandatory minimum. You could be on probation for the entirety of that sentence. So I think for the defense to get up there and ask for 10 years is saying, we recognize how serious these crimes are, and we're not, trying to say, oh, just give him the minimum because that's what it is. I think they're saying, he's accepted responsibility, he's apologized, he showed remorse. We want these families to know that we think this is serious, but we don't think it's serious enough that he should spend the rest of his life in prison. They talked a lot about his son will spend the rest of his life in prison. Does that make it fair that he should spend the rest of his life in prison when they had two totally different levels of criminal culpability there? So they just talked a lot about that. And I think that 10 years as judge, we're taking this seriously. Factor this in. That's how much the Crumbly parents up in Michigan, they were also charged with their son's crime there for the school shooting that carried out there. They got. So I think they were just saying, this is what we've seen. Here it is. And this is the first of its kind in Georgia. It's one of the first in the nation. It's the only one in the nation where actual murder charges are involved. The other one was involuntary manslaughter.
Yeah.
So whatever happens here, the next judge is going to look at this case, factor that in. So, it's just a lot for the judge to consider and for the defense and everyone involved.
Colin was given the opportunity to make a statement. He chose not to. You were in the courtroom. What was his demeanor like during the victim impact statements, and how did that compare to the hearing just days before with his son, Colt?
Extremely different. We heard a lot from the prosecutors during the Colt Gray hearing of how he did this for fame. He did this because he thought he would get some of the notoriety that some other school shooters had, just really disturbing underlying reasons. And in the months after, he was joking about the shooting with his mom. There was no remorse, there was no regret there. And he just kind of looked down for most of it, was very stoic. He only got really upset when his interview clips were playing and prosecutors were showing why they thought he faked it. With Colt Gray, he just looked sad. You could tell that he understood his decisions had affected the lives of so many people. He looked at each victim. Some of them, he would look away for a moment, but it seemed like he was listening to what each of them had to say. The only time we saw him really making a ton of movement was when the prosecutors were saying that he told his daughter to lie, he did these things, and he was just shaking his head like that's not true. But for the most part, he was just listening. He said his piece when he took the stand back in February, early March, and he kind of left it at that. And I think he was just, this is where I'm at, this is what's coming. Again, his attorneys were asking for 10 years. They weren't saying, we think time served is enough. They were saying, these are serious crimes. We do think he needs to spend time in jail for them.
Based on everything you just said, his appearing to accept his fate, what his attorneys asked for, what you learned from talking to the parole expert. It seems to me he's just going to accept his sentence and serve it. But does he have appeal options at this point?
He does. So his attorneys have told us that they plan to go to the appellate court on multiple grounds. They weren't specifying exactly which ones, but they said they felt these charges were a bit overbroad. Second-degree murder. Again, this is the first time we've ever seen that in the United States for a parent, where they're charged with murder for something their kid carried out. And one quote from Judge Nicholas Prim that really stood out to me yesterday is he said, "I'm envisioning two scenarios in my head. In the first, you fail as a parent.
Yeah.
You don't take any of these measures. But on September 4th, Colt wakes up and he changes his mind." He goes, "No one would know. No one would charge you with a crime." He goes, "In the second scenario, Colt goes through and commits this atrocity, and the state is asking for 80 years." He goes, "Your actions in those two scenarios, they don't change. And in one, it's not a crime at all, and the other, it's 80 years." And he says that's how criminal negligence works. And that is something he wanted to factor into that and how that worked here.
Okay, so look for some potential appeals from his attorneys. After all, it's what they are paid to do. But as I recall, the jury came back pretty quickly with a verdict in this case.
They did. I think the attorneys are more concerned if the charges are too far, especially with the murder charge.
Too
So I'm not
far-reaching.
quite sure what legal argument they will make there. Of course, that's up for them. I'm sure they're doing their research and they have prepared for a possible appeal. And it's important to point out that during the trial, there were certain points where they would make an objection and they would say, "Judge, can you make sure to note that for appeal?"
Okay.
They were going
Yes.
to this case knowing we don't know what's happening. The jury could come back and say not guilty, but we are going to preserve all this stuff for appellate purposes. And they would say, for appellate purposes, can we do this? They would stop the trial and
Yeah.
say, we just want this to be made aware so that we could later on have an appellate court look over that and say, was this a mistake here?
Right.
Is this something we could overrule on? And another thing that stuck out to me is Judge Prim, he said the first, I think it was 39 witnesses in Colin's trial did not mention Colin once.
Yeah.
And
I
he was
noticed
just
that.
saying, this criminal negligence, this is a crime. They did charge you. Not only did a grand jury come back and say, yes, we have reasonable cause that you did commit these crimes, but then an actual jury during his trial said that. So you would have to, we don't know if an appellate court would look at that differently, but at least two separate juries felt that was enough.
Meanwhile, his son choosing to plead guilty to all 55 counts against him. He did not take it to trial. So what options does he have now?
Colt really has not many options. Whenever you plead guilty, you give up a lot of your appellate rights. There's very few things you can do. They read you your rights when they say that, and you say by pleading guilty, you cannot withdraw a guilty plea. I would also just say the evidence against him, I mean, right after the shooting, he's saying he did it. Colt had at one point intended to plead insanity, according to the jail calls. They sent a forensic psychologist to him, and the psychologist said that was never even on the table. He was saying he had mania and schizophrenia, but all the symptoms he would describe did not actually match that. He said it was just all kind of this plan to do this horrible act, get famous from it, and get off with it, essentially. But they were able to find out that he doesn't have a lot of these really serious mental illnesses. He had anxiety, he had depression, some thoughts of self-harm, but it was nothing like, there were no voices in his head telling him to do that, because the way he would report those symptoms is just not grounded in reality. So for Colt, he doesn't really have many appeal options. Of course, there's, some questions he could raise, but he got life without parole. There's just not much you can do about that. He will be spending the rest of his life from 14 until he dies in prison.
Anybody else potentially going to be charged in this case?
Not that we know of. The mother, everyone's been asking, why isn't Marcy Gray charged? The the prosecution called her disgusting, a failure of a mother. The judge has said, no one's arguing. Part of his speech to Colin is, you failed to keep the kids away from Marcy and all these bad influences she had. She's on the jail calls laughing about the school shooting with her son after this happened, calling him a celebrity, saying she's going to make a shrine to him. A lot of really disturbing actions on her part. At some point, she had threatened to kill Colt. She had also done a lot to kind of just wreak havoc on the family dynamic from the evidence we saw in court. DFAC says they were able to substantiate 12 claims of abuse and neglect against Marcy. They could refer those for criminal prosecution. It's up to DFAC how much evidence they have. But the DA in Barrow County said he personally would not bring any of those cases because that would require putting Colt up on the stand as a victim. And he just doesn't have the stomach that.
Yeah.
And of course, the other jurisdictions have their chances, but Marcy didn't have custody. If she did have custody, I think she would be charged based on the evidence we've seen. But because she had some drug issues, she was in and out of rehab and out of jail, they had taken the kids away from Marcy as part of a DFAC safety plan. And in this situation,
Wow.
she didn't have custody.
You've been so intertwined with this community for so long. How do you sense they're feeling after this? It is the first day back to school, after all, in Apalachee after a long summer break.
It's tough timing. It keeps coming up and up and up. We heard from the principal at Apalachee the other day during Colt's sentencing, and she was saying, it's the first day of school, or it's the first, back teacher preparations, and we all should be having this great time and talking about all these things we're excited for, and instead we're thinking of school shooter drills. We're thinking of this. And for us, it's not just a check mark. We need to be prepared for worst case scenario. They've lived that worst case scenario. A lot of them share that trauma from the past couple of years. So she was just saying, preparing for back to school will never look the same. For a lot of these families, different places in Barrow County will never look the same. A lot of these families were sitting in the courtroom when they had to play video of the worst day of everyone's lives as they saw the shooting happen. That was part of the evidence for Colin's trial to establish that the crime happened. They were saying the flashbacks from that video from that day just stick with them, and just the heartbreak and the loss in the community. I mean, you'll go to different restaurants, you still see the Apalachee strong and the hearts, and it's a small community, it's a tight-knit community, and it really just affected everyone. I've spoken with people and they'll hear a helicopter, and that's triggering because there were so many police helicopters that day. They'll hear a siren and kind of jump. They don't like the dark. Those symptoms don't go away. It's like the families were telling us, it's a life sentence for them. Nothing can ever measure up to the sentence he got. Even Colt. They said Colt will spend the rest of his life in jail, but he chose that. They did not.
Grace King, new context this morning from inside the courtroom and new reporting as well. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.